ZIGZAG in One, a place where we honestly discuss how to embrace the zigs and the zags in our crazy lives. Running away is not an option. Living in defeat is not an option. Instead, learning how to keep moving forward is what we'll do together, one nugget of wisdom at a time. Your host is Melanie Brown. She's navigated a few zigs and zags in her life with the determination to never give up. Expect great stories and lots of laughs. Are you ready? Let's do it.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the ZIGZAG in One podcast. I'm your host, Melanie Brown. So several months ago, I read a book titled We Too, How the Church Can Respond Redemptively to the Sexual Abuse Crisis. I just have to tell you, there was so much powerful information in that book, and I wanted to share my interview with the author, Mary DeMuth, during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Even if you've never been sexually assaulted, I urge you to listen as Mary shares ways that we can respond redemptively if a friend or a loved one has been sexually abused. Now, we discuss adult topics in this episode, so please make sure your children aren't with you when you listen. Mary and her husband Patrick have been married for 29 years, and they have 3 adult children. She's authored 40 books. Wow. And she hosts a daily podcast called Pray Every Day. It's just a few minutes long, and I promise you it starts your day off right. She also speaks across the country and around the world. And if that wasn't enough, she's an artist. And over the last few months when she's been on a sabbatical, she's been posting on her social media all of her artwork. And let me just tell you something. It is not only beautiful, but it truly inspires you. So make sure, after you listen today, that you follow her on all the social media platforms so that you can enjoy all of her creative talents. Please join me for my conversation with Mary DeMuth. Welcome, Mary. I am so honored to spend time with you today.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So as an author, speaker, podcaster, and artist, we could talk for hours about everything you do. And wow, you do a lot, sweet friend.
I do probably too much.
I understand that. But I'd like to focus on your book, We Too, How the Church Can Respond Redemptively to the Sexual Abuse Crisis.
Yeah, so that's definitely probably one of the hardest books that I've written. But I think in terms of kingdom impact, hopefully, I mean, I can't measure that, but that's my hope and prayer is that it will empower the church to do better when it comes to people who are broken.
Yes, and I will tell you, it was a hard read for me in the fact that it was so dense with information, which this is not a topic that I personally am familiar with, but it's something that I do care about deeply. And so I read and underlined and took so many notes in your book. It is filled with such powerful information, sadly, about a topic that's been in the news way too frequently. And I wanted to share a couple of statistics that you shared because when I read them, broke my heart to know how pervasive sexual abuse is in our culture. So, for example, 120 million girls globally have experienced forced sex. 1 in 4 women in the U.S. have been assaulted, and 1 in 6 men in the U.S. have experienced sexual abuse or rape. And sadly, you are in these statistics. Would you mind sharing your story and where your journey began?
Sure. So I grew up in a pretty unsafe home. My mom was on her second marriage when I was 5 years old and was I went to a babysitter's house after kindergarten because there was that lag of time between kindergarten and when my mom would pick me up. And so these neighborhood boys, teenagers, came to the door very quickly. I later learned one of them lived right next door to the babysitter's house, and there was no grooming for what they did. They just immediately took me out to the woods and they sexually abused me. And that just continued to go on. Of course, they said that they would murder my parents if I told anyone. And they used a bad word to describe what they were doing. I was only 5. I didn't want to say that word out loud. I was terrified, of course. But as the boys began to invite their friends, and sometimes this would happen in their house, or their mom was baking cookies in the other room, I knew that I just had this feeling like I'm going to die and I need to tell someone. And so I just, I don't know why I ended up telling my babysitter, not my parents. And, she said that she'd tell my mom, and I believed her. And the next day the boys came, knocked on the door. She pushed me out into the air, into the day with them. And I thought that my mom knew and didn't care. And so
Mm.
at that point, I knew that there was no one on earth who would protect me. And so I decided, I mean, it seems kind of sophisticated for a 5-year-old, as pretty adult-like, I guess. But I thought, well, okay, no one's going to take care of me. Well, I'm going to pretend to sleep. It's the only thing I could do to protect myself. And so for maybe the last month, I don't have the timeline completely accurate just because I was so young, but maybe the last month of my kindergarten year, I would run home from kindergarten, eat a very fast sandwich, run into the babysitter's bedroom, pull the covers over my head, and pretend to sleep for hours and hours and hours. And thankfully, she was just too lazy to try to rouse me, and I basically saved myself, so to speak.
Mm.
And that feeling of violation and that mark of abuse followed me for till today. There were lots of perpetrators in my life growing up, and I constantly found myself being found by them and having to run away. I was lucky enough to be able to escape several different times of different advances from a variety of different people. So I'm grateful for that. I am a runner, so I'm not a very good runner, but I am a runner. So I credit my running away to that. And so, yeah, so then I didn't know Christ at all. I grew up in a non-Christian home and ended up meeting Christ through Young Life at 15. And that began the healing journey, but the healing journey is still going on today.
When I read your story in your book, it just really touched me, and you just spoke of that, not knowing what to do. You were so young, and how you did speak up. You told someone, and that person betrayed your trust, and that part right there is so saddening to me, especially thinking about how you were so young and you didn't have a lot of tools in your toolbox. You probably thought, even then, why bother if that person that I told is not even going to help me? And it's sad hearing that you thought your mom knew and she didn't care. That really is saddening to me.
Yeah, it just makes you feel as a child that there's nobody on your side. No one really loves you. No one really cares. And there was other things going on in my life at that time where that was being confirmed in other ways. So it just totally made sense to me that, of course, my mom wouldn't care because she usually doesn't spend time with me anyway. So that was difficult, definitely.
Yes. So when were you able to tell and start your healing process?
It was pretty soon after my coming to Christ that I ended up talking to a relative about it. And I had to tell the story over and over and over because they would not
Mm.
believe me. And so I have that deep empathy for survivors who tell someone and nothing happens or they get shamed for it. And I also have empathy for survivors who tell it and people don't believe them. And so I've had all those kind of difficult experiences, especially as a brand new Christian and trying to make my way. A lot of my healing, though, did come at the end of telling my story. I began to disclose it later, end of high school and then in college. And I was just blessed to be able to be surrounded by Christ followers who dared to listen and pray for me for those 4 years. I basically just cried my time through college. I just cried the whole time. And I didn't go to a Christian college or anything like that. I just had a good support system there. And that's, I think, the lion's share of my healing happened in those really ordinary spaces.
And that's beautiful, because that is what the Overcomer ministry that I'm very honored to be a part of. That's what we do, is we share stories. And there is an important aspect of healing in that we share our stories and are heard, which I heard you say, is that those friends of yours, those people in the church, listened to you and cared. And that is so incredibly powerful. And now, as part of your ministry, you are not only a survivor, but you're passionate about the underdog, the oppressed, those who don't have a voice. And so by you sharing your story in your books and when you speak, you are infusing courage in others to do the same, to share their stories. And I am so thankful for that part of your ministry. I know you're a minister in the respect of you teach at Christian conferences to writers, and that's another part of your ministry. But I am just very thankful for what you are doing, because I know when you have experienced something and you share that with somebody else and you help them walk along that journey, it's very, very powerful. I have a rare disease, and I can speak to somebody else who has been either recently diagnosed or struggling in that disease. And I can relate to them like no one else can, just as you can relate to someone who has experienced sexual abuse in a way that others can't. So thank you for the ministry that you do. It's very encouraging to know there are people out there fighting for that cause.
Well, that's encouraging, and knowing just the climate of today, it's been heartening to know I've been beating this drum since the 90s. So I've
Wow.
been talking about it for a long time, and there's been a lot of crickets. And so to finally have people waking up to it, and to the importance of healing and the importance of protection and all of those kinds of things has been really great to be a part of, and really humbling to see God moving in that way, which is just lovely.
Yes. And you, in your book, you talk about the Me Too movement that was ushered in by Ashley Judd when she exposed Harvey Weinstein's sexually abusive behaviors. And that really did usher in a lot more exposure. And then you took that same theme of Me Too and you added We Too, because you wanted to address the need for the church to jump in there and to help those who have been victims of sexual abuse so that they can respond redemptively. And that's the We Too part of your book title. And when I first saw that, I thought, wow, that is an interesting connection. And I want us to talk about that, because when I read your book, you gave so many examples of how the church didn't respond necessarily the best way. So can you talk about that a little bit?
I can. One of the things that I've been criticized about is that I wasn't abused in a church context, so I can't speak to that situation. But I will say a couple things about that. One, not to defend myself, but just to say the people that abused me were Mormons, so they were in some sort of church.
Yes.
And when I told, I received the same kind of response that many people in the church receive when they say that pastor hurt me. This kind of laissez-faire, lackadaisical, I'll do something about it, but they don't really do anything about it. So I have that I have that in my story. But all that to say, yes, lots of examples of churches kind of circling the wagons and protecting their reputation over protecting the cries of the victims. And I
Mm-hmm.
think, as I think about it more deeply and have been praying about it, I think there's something there about the model of church that we have in the United States and, in the Western world in particular. We have kind of a celebrity driven model of, the guy at the top, or, in whatever structure, whether it's the youth pastor or the main pastor or the, other pastor, they tend to have this kind of godlike status. And
Yes, sadly, you're right.
and so nobody and everyone respects and loves, and the whole organization hinges on that one person. And so we see that with the Hybel situation. So if one is taken out, the whole church completely suffers. But when that person is accused, nobody wants to believe it. And the familiar narrative, and we've seen it over and over and over again, is that people will bring an accusation, it will be squashed. More people will bring an accusation to like an elder board or a board of directors. It'll be squashed. The victims are not trying to be vindictive. They're just like, we don't want this to happen to anyone else because this has ruined my life. So they, in desperation, go to the press, not to be famous, this is the last thing they want to be known for. But They go to the press because they want the person to stop what they're doing. And then in that moment, what typically happens, if it is a ministry leader who's well loved and well respected, the narrative will be, look at what Satan's trying to do to the church. He's using these people to tear down the church. This is spiritual warfare. So let's attack the victims who have brought this up. And usually by this time, there's a handful to 15 to 20 other people who now have come forward. Mm-hmm. And then eventually the board of directors has to say, oh, wait a minute. Maybe this is true. And then they look awful because they have shamed publicly all these people, and then everything falls apart. And I think part of that goes back to this thing of person at the top is untouchable. And the other thing about that is that if you are in that kind of ministry structure, you surround yourself by yes people. And so
yes,
you no longer community. You have people saying you're awesome, you're great, and they won't call you on your little things. And so those little things get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then suddenly it's this thing. And so I talk a lot about, we heal better together. You can't heal in isolation, but I also believe you cannot lead in isolation. If you lead in isolation, you are headed toward a fall.
That's very well said, because not that I have been involved to the degree that you have with this topic, just what I've seen on the news and within church culture, I think you have a lot of wisdom about what your interpretation of the situation is. So a couple of quotes that I want to pull out from your book and just have you discuss for a minute, if you will. So the first one that caught my attention is, the church's deliberate muteness has allowed the industry of sexual abuse to flourish unimpeded. And you kind of shared a little bit about that, but I was very struck by that. So what are you wanting with this book to accomplish as far as the church? What would you like to see happen with the church?
Well, ultimately, the Holy Spirit is in charge of the church, so he can do whatever he wants with the
Correct.
church. But I would say what I'm heartened by is, I feel like what's happening, and what my heart in writing the book was, is exposure and repentance and light brought into the dark places. And I think there needs to be, my heart in all of it is for revival. I think prior to revival, what usually happens, if you look through revivals in history, is there's a big expose of some sort of sin, of something that's going on in the darkness. There's a giant repentance, even if you didn't participate in it. Like Nehemiah, he repented on behalf of Israel. It wasn't necessarily his sin, but he repented on behalf. And then once the light has come, then reformation and restoration and revival can break out. And so that's really my prayer in writing the book, is that we've been too quiet about this, and especially about the porn epidemic. I think porn, if we want to really talk about symbiosis, the porn epidemic is fueling all of this. And I mean, if you're a young person who is watching exploitive narratives, and you begin to believe that those are true, like if someone says no, they actually mean yes, then of course there's going to be an epidemic of very confused men who somehow have been fed this total lie that, that saying no means yes, and saying yes means more. So we have to be really careful about this. We see a lot of the statistics about pastors who struggle with porn is very high, and I don't have the exact number in front of me right now, but it's significant. And I think a lot of times our leaders are not talking about it because they're struggling with it.
Well,
And we have to blow the lid off of this, because if there is sexual exploitation like that, this is not a victimless crime. Not only are you reprogramming the minds of people that could potentially become perpetrators, but there is someone behind that camera who is being exploited. And then there's the nature of the porn addiction, where it's less and less satisfying each deeper level that you go, and suddenly you have to exploit somebody else in person to get the same high. And so, hello, there we go again with more sexual abuse. And so we have to really talk about the darkness and not glorify it at all, but expose it. We're called as Christians to expose the darkness.
that is a lot to chew on, but I think that
Yes.
you're 100% right with the porn. I just a few months ago did some in-depth research about the sex trafficking and how porn is related to that, and so it's this big vicious circle about sexual fantasies, and as you said, it once they have what they are exposed to, whether it's in person or through magazines or videos or whatever, it just has to heighten every single time. And eventually it will impact many, many people and ruin their lives. And that's something I agree that the church needs to spend time on discussing, because I honestly feel ill equipped as a member of the church if somebody were to come to me and say, I have a porn addiction, I want help for this. So even that, discussing it as what it is, but also to equip the members of the church on how to be a listener, as you said earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and not that I can fix the problem, but I can listen and then I can help them to get the help that will actually make a difference in their lives. So,
Well, and we talk a lot. I know you talk a lot about stories, and that's the power of telling a story. Because if you keep your addiction, whatever it is, whether it's to porn or something else or some secret sin that you're indulging in, I know for me, when I've kept those things quiet, shame just flourished, and this
yes.
depression and anxiety, and you're never going to amount to much. All those bad voices in your head, and how dare you call yourself a Christian? All those things, they dissipate when you finally let it out to somebody else. And there is power in releasing your story. It's terrifying, but it's the only way toward freedom. You will not be set free if you try to tackle it on your own.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up about stories, because that was the other quote I wanted us to talk about. So, the one that I really related to is to change people's minds about how we can respond to the sexual abuse crisis redemptively. We must return to storytelling, friendship, and building relational capital. So, that's what you just discussed. And I feel like you are on the right track with that. And I talk a little bit about what you mean by building relational capital, because I think that is a very important part of this.
Well, I think we've become really adept at building superficial capital in our social media world.
Yes.
I was talking to a friend of mine, and she has a son like in his 20s, and he said that he wanted to take this girl out, and then he took her out, and the mom of the son said, well, was she pretty? He's like, Mom, I don't even care about that. I just want to talk to someone who can carry on a conversation, and she could not. And I was like, wow, that's really telling. First of all, it shows that she's raised a really sweet boy who wants to have conversation with a girl.
Yes.
And values that as the most important thing. But it's a critique of our culture that we don't know how to relate to each other anymore. We have used our devices to separate us from actually doing like Matthew 18, which is, if someone has sinned against you, go to that brother, bring someone else, take it to the church. We never do that. We just vent in veiled terms on social media, but we never go to the person directly. I think about a situation I was in with a friendship, and it started escalating very quickly over a conflict that we had on email. And I said, I don't want to discuss this on email. We need to let's pick up the phone and talk about that. And the other person said, I refuse to. I was like, wow, what is wrong with us if we cannot at least talk it through? Because vocal inflection or just seeing someone face to face, we're very bold when we're not face to face, but we're much more meek and humble and sweet when we are face to face. And I think we've lost that. So to build relational capital is to listen, is to value your in real life relationships more than your curated social media life. And I fear that the reason we're having so many people battling depression and anxiety is because of the social media epidemic and the abuse of it.
Well said. Very well said. So even Jesus used parables or stories to connect people first and then to teach truth. So when we share our stories, like you said, we're connecting. And that storytelling, that friendship, that building relational capital, if all of those things are in place, I believe that when a person has to talk about what zigzags or struggles they have faced in their life, and they have someone that they have built that relational capital with, not that it's going to make it all rosy and easy, but it will cultivate an environment where they feel safe talking about their story. Do you find this to be true?
I do. And it is a risk, of course.
Yes.
Being authentic is a risk because you risk someone pushing against you. You risk an unsafe person if they're not safe. They may set you back on your healing journey. But I would rather live in a world where people were honest with each other than people playing roles and not ever connecting. And I think that's part of the loneliness we have in our culture right now. We've curated ourselves so much without being authentic and really honest. I mean, we have like this fake authenticity online, but the question then becomes, am I really loved? Because no one really knows who I really am, because I haven't really told who I really am to the people in my life. And so I think this is part of the discipleship journey. We think about making disciples and we think of like, okay, we're going to get together once a week and we're going to memorize verses together and talk about, the book of Acts or something. But I actually think discipleship is more of there's a common word in the New Testament called peripateo, which just means to walk alongside. I think it's one of the most common Greek words in the New Testament because you have Jesus walking here, Jesus walking there, the disciples walking here. And it means to walk, but it also means in the manner in which. And so to peripateo with someone, it's the same kind of word that Paul uses when he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So we do life with people and we walk with them, but we also model what we want to see in them. And I believe relationships is part of the discipleship model, that we have to train people how to have relationships and how to be authentic and how to be vulnerable and how to discern who's a wolf in sheep's clothing, how to discern who's a safe person, how to discern when to share your story, but also the importance of letting yourself out. So I think that's part of it.
I love when you say that because it is so important to have those deep relationships where you do walk alongside someone, whether it's somebody older than you or younger than you or your same age. Our culture is very much lacking in those deep relationships where trust is built. Whereas you said about the pastors that are in roles and they have yes men all around them. I don't want my friends to be yes men to me. Yeah. If I am making a mistake or I'm not doing something that I need to be doing, I want them to tell me because I want to have a better walk with Christ. I want to have a better impact and influence in my life. And if I'm veering off the right path, I need somebody relationally with me that I have been walking alongside. And that does give us comfort in feeling safe about sharing our story. So I love how you describe that. So our time is just about up. And so if you would, as we wrap up, what would be your one takeaway for listeners today?
Yeah, it is, of course, to tell your story and to be brave enough to tell your story. Because as I've shared with audiences before, an untold story never heals. You cannot heal in isolation. It's the whole point of We Too and this idea of healing in community. But the other side of that, there's a flip side to that, and that is to become the kind of person that is invitational for other people's stories. So in other words,
Mm.
to be the kind of friend that doesn't jump to conclusions, that listens excessively, and errs on the side of listening and asking good questions, because that's how we start the revolution. Yes, we model it by telling our story, but we change people's lives by listening to theirs and becoming great listeners.
That's yes, right on track. So I want to make sure that listeners know what I found when I went to your website. It is full of a ton of resources. You have 40 books, or is it
Yeah.
41 now that you've released something just recently?
Just the 40th just released. I have some more in the
Okay.
pipeline.
Oh, goodness. You
Yeah,
are busy. Good
I'm a
grief.
little bit busy.
I love it though, because what you're putting out helps me as a writer, but helps others along their journey, especially with this very difficult topic of sexual abuse. So again, thank you. But I wanted to make sure that listeners knew about the resources that they can find at your website, and that is marydemuth.com, MaryDemuth.com. And for those who are survivors, I found something I think you desperately need to look at, and that is the 21-day email resource that you will send out to them if they simply put in their name and email address, that helps them to reframe the past and find newfound hope for tomorrow. I thought that was just incredible.
Yeah, the quick link to that is we2.org/21 days. And so it makes it pretty easy. And if you need, if someone's like wondering if they need resources, like they have a friend that told them that they've had this terrible story and they don't know what to do. If you go to we2.org/resources, it has all the resources there that I've vetted. And if you just want it as a PDF to hand to your pastor, we2.org/pastors, it has a 31-page PDF with clickable links of ministries and books and resources and statistics and everything that you would ever need to know to help someone with this story.
I noticed that you have several books that are on the topic of sexual abuse, not just this one. Would you mind
Right.
mentioning the titles of those? And I'll put those
Yeah.
in the show notes as well.
Yeah. So my husband and I wrote the book Not Marked: Finding Hope and Healing After Sexual Abuse. And we, as a married couple, struggled in our sex life because of my past, and so we co-wrote that book. So I wrote about the healing journey in there, and then at the end of every chapter, he writes about what it's like, because it wasn't his story, what it's like to love a sexual abuse victim toward
Mm.
health. And we believe that the marriage bed can be a place of healing for sexual abuse victims. We've seen so many. I've had countless wives and husbands. Some husbands come to me and say, I haven't had sex for 4 years, or I just can't do it anymore, or whatever. And it's because of this pervasive pain and trauma, of course. And so we wrote that. I also wrote a memoir called Thin Places, which basically chronicles my story in a memoir format. And so those are some of the books that I've written about that.
Yeah, I noticed those, and I thought it was real important because I know I'm always looking for resources when I'm going through my struggles. And so if someone is having a difficult time finding resources specifically about sexual abuse, I thought those would just be fantastic. And now knowing about the one that you co-wrote with your husband, that is an incredible perspective.
Yeah,
Definitely.
it's a hard, I mean, it was so hard to write and so kind of embarrassing and difficult, but we have found that when we talk about it frankly in front of audiences, people are relieved to finally have space in their marriage to talk about something that's so hard to talk about.
Yes. So, Mary, thank you so much for sharing your story and being vulnerable. And I love that this book encourages the church to be better.
Mhm.
I am just so thankful for that. And thank you for your time today.
Well, I appreciate it. And I do love the church so much. And that's why I am offering this kind of prophetic imagination from the margins, because I want to see her rise up and be what she is called to be. And that is the healing of the nations. I mean, we're supposed to be the most amazing, community on earth. So I'd love to see that happen.
Well, and I do want to make sure and note that you were not accusatory towards the church in this book. You were very much trying to rouse them to be better.
Yes, I love the church. And that's the reason why I wanted to rouse the church. It wasn't a point the finger. It was a, how can we do better?
Yes. So, listeners, make sure you check out the show notes so that you can get all of the resources that we have discussed today. And remember, when life zigs and zags, and you know that it will, remember what Mary said, how important your story is and how healing can come from that. And make sure that you're a good listener if someone comes to you with their story. Thanks for hanging in there, friends. I know this was a tough topic, but I truly believe it's an important one. I encourage you to buy Mary's book and visit her website to learn more about how we can support and encourage those who we know and love who have been sexually abused. Join me on April 21st for Holocaust Remembrance Day. You don't want to miss my interview with Holocaust survivor Eva Eigner. Until then, keep moving forward.